Claire adjusted her backpack strap nervously as she approached the gate, her boarding pass clutched between her fingers. Airports always unsettled her, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the transience of it all, thousands of people, rushing in every direction, lives colliding for a few fleeting moments before scattering again. She had just finished another grueling semester in graduate school, her mind overloaded with research papers and sleepless nights, and this trip home felt like a small victory. All she wanted was a quiet flight, a seat by the window, and a chance to drift into sleep above the clouds. The boarding line moved steadily forward. Flight attendants scanned tickets with polite smiles, ushering people into the jet bridge. Claire tucked her hair behind her ear and stepped onto the plane. The familiar scent of recycled air and faint coffee hit her as she entered the narrow aisle. She smiled at a stewardess, then moved toward her row. Seat 17A, window, just as she preferred. Sliding into the seat, she pressed her palm against the cool glass and watched the glow of San Diego's city lights outside. Rows of headlights streamed like golden rivers along the freeways. She exhaled, finally relaxing. Soon the lights would fade into darkness, and she would rise above it all. Passengers shuffled past, stowing bags overhead, murmuring greetings or complaints. Across the aisle, a young mother struggled with a stroller and a diaper bag while holding her baby against her shoulder. Further ahead, a businessman tapped furiously on his phone, thumbs moving faster than Claire could follow. Each person carried their own story, their own urgency. It was then she noticed him. Near the front, in seat 6C, sat a man who didn't quite blend with the rest. His posture was perfectly upright, not stiff but purposeful. He scanned the cabin in slow, methodical sweeps, his eyes alert yet calm, as if cataloging everything: the exits, the passengers, the flight attendants' movements. His build was strong, his shoulders broad even beneath a casual jacket. His presence radiated control, and for reasons she couldn't explain, Claire's gaze lingered longer than it should have. The man Mark rested his hands loosely on his lap. He looked neither nervous nor distracted. He looked prepared. Claire quickly pulled her attention back to her window. She didn't want to be caught staring. Still, something about him unsettled her, though not in a threatening way. More in the way a lighthouse unsettled sailors. Not dangerous, but impossible to ignore. The boarding announcement ended. The cabin crew secured the doors, and the captain's voice hummed over the intercom, confident and routine. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight 482. We're scheduled for a smooth red-eye service tonight, arriving on time in Dallas just after sunrise. Weather looks clear, so sit back and enjoy the flight." Engines whirred to life beneath the wings. Claire's stomach fluttered as the plane pushed back from the gate. She loved this moment, the anticipation of takeoff, the quiet before the powerful surge forward. The baby across the aisle began to cry, fussing against the home. Claire smiled faintly, remembering her younger siblings years ago. She slid a book from her bag, one she had promised herself she'd finish weeks earlier. Tonight, maybe, she could read undisturbed. The plane taxied onto the runway, pausing for clearance. Claire rested her head against the seat, eyes drifting toward the man in 6C. He didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, didn't even glance at the safety card. Instead, his gaze remained outward, focused on something unseen, as though even the engine's roar was background noise. The sudden thrust of takeoff jolted Claire back into the moment. The aircraft surged forward, pressing her into the seat. Buildings blurred past until only streaks of light remained. Then, with a powerful lift, the city fell away beneath them, lights scattering like tiny constellations. Claire's ears popped as they pierced the night sky, the sensation both thrilling and calming. Within minutes, the plane leveled. Seatbelt signs chimed off, and the crew began moving through the aisles. Passengers settled into routines, tablets glowing, headphones slipping on, soft conversations blending with engine hum. Claire opened her book, though her eyes drifted off into the window, where darkness stretched endless and stars shimmered faintly above the clouds. For a moment, everything felt ordinary. But Mark knew better. He leaned slightly, eyes narrowing at the subtle vibration beneath his seat. It wasn't the usual shudder of turbulence. It was uneven, irregular. Years in the Navy had sharpened his senses to machines in distress. Engines spoke a language most people couldn't hear, but he understood it. Something about the rhythm was off. He didn't move dramatically, didn't draw attention. Instead, he cataloged the sound, the tremor, the faint metallic echo. He had lived too long in cockpits not to recognize trouble when it whispered. Claire, oblivious, underlined a line in her book with her finger. But a moment later, turbulence jolted the cabin sharply. Drinks sloshed. A few passengers gasped. The baby wailed louder. Claire's heart jumped. She gripped the armrest, glancing around nervously. Mark's expression didn't change. His hands remained steady on his knees, eyes calculating. He scanned the wing through his window, noting airflow patterns. His mind worked like a pilot's, rehearsing scenarios, recalling drills he had practiced thousands of times. He didn't like what he felt, but panic wasn't in his nature. Claire tried to calm herself, forcing her eyes back to the page. But her chest still fluttered. Something about that turbulence felt different, sharper, like the jolt of gears grinding instead of clouds tossing. She breathed slowly, telling herself she was imagining things. Planes flew every day without issue. Still, when she looked forward, she saw him watching. His gaze wasn't on the attendants or other passengers. It was fixed on the structure of the plane itself. And for the first time, Claire wondered if the man in seat 6C knew something the rest of them didn't. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow as the aircraft reached cruising altitude. Outside the window, the sky was a velvet black blanket punctured by distant stars. The hum of engines filled the silence, steady and reassuring to most of the passengers. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisles, offering water, juice, or tiny packets of pretzels. For Claire, the earlier turbulence still lingered in her mind. She tried to push it away, focusing on her book, but the words blurred. Her gaze drifted toward the aisle, where people began to relax into their own rhythms. The businessman in 14C loosened his tie, sighing as he scrolled through his phone. The young mother across from her bounced her baby gently, whispering lullabies. A couple near the back laughed quietly, sharing earbuds and a movie. It all seemed normal, perfectly ordinary, yet Claire couldn't shake the unease. She lifted her head slightly and searched for the man in 6C. He hadn't moved much. His posture was still precise, his attention sharpened on details most ignored. He wasn't reading, wasn't dozing, wasn't sipping a drink like everyone else. He was observing. Mark felt it again, the vibration underfoot. Subtle, but there. He knew the song of engines, the way turbines spoke through metal and air. This wasn't turbulence. This was mechanical. The rhythm of the left engine was faltering, ever so slightly. To anyone else, it would seem like random shaking. But to him, it was the telltale stutter of a system straining against failure. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself. No need to alarm anyone prematurely. The crew would know soon enough pilots had instruments to read what he could only sense. Still, his instincts tightened. He shifted his gaze toward the wing outside, watching how air slipped over the surface. He calculated silently, noting details the way he once had during night flights over hostile territory. Claire, almost without realizing it, kept glancing. Forward, She tried to catch his expression. Was he worried? Was she just imagining it? Her stomach tightened when their eyes met briefly. She looked away quickly, embarrassed, but the question burned in her mind. A sudden ding sounded overhead as the intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through, calm but tight, each word chosen with care. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a mechanical issue with one of our engines. It's nothing to be alarmed about, but as a precaution, we'll be beginning an emergency descent. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Oxygen masks may deploy automatically. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin. The words froze the air. For a heartbeat, the cabin was silent, every passenger stunned into disbelief. Then the murmurs began. A nervous laugh here, a gasp there. Someone whispered, "Emergency descent?" Another voice snapped. "He said not to panic, right?" Claire's hands trembled as she clutched the armrest. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Emergency. Descent. That wasn't a phrase you heard on normal flights. She glanced around. The businessman dropped his phone into his lap, jaw slack. The mother clutched her baby closer, whispering prayers. And then it happened. From above, oxygen masks dropped, with a mechanical clatter dangling like pale yellow vines. The sight alone sparked panic. A child screamed. Passengers fumbled clumsily, struggling to fit the elastic bands over their heads. Claire's chest tightened as adrenaline flooded her veins. She grabbed the nearest mask, yanking it toward her face, but her hands shook too badly to fit the strap. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Then she heard a voice, calm, commanding. Breathe slowly. Put it over your mouth and nose. Tighten it, then inhale. It was him. Mark had leaned slightly into the aisle, his voice steady as stone. His eyes locked on her, his hand gesturing firmly. The authority in his tone cut through the chaos. Without hesitation, Claire followed his instruction. The mask sealed over her face, cool air rushing through. Her lungs expanded. Relief. Around her, the panic spread. People cried out, some hyperventilating, others unable to manage the straps. Flight attendants moved quickly, voices raised, but the cabin was a storm of fear. The plane jolted suddenly, dropping what felt like several feet in an instant. A collective scream erupted. Drinks flew from trays, books tumbled, bags slid under seats. Claire's stomach lurched as if she had been thrown onto a roller coaster without warning. Her fingernails dug into the armrest. Mark's eyes darted to the ceiling, then back to the wing. He remained collected, though his pulse quickened. He had been here before, not in a commercial jet, but in helicopters and fighter planes shot at mid-mission, engines sputtering, alarms screaming. Panic never saved anyone. Precision did. The captain's voice returned, sharper now. Brace for impact. Flight attendants, prepare passengers. We are attempting to stabilize. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Brace for impact. The three words no passenger ever wanted to hear. Claire's throat tightened. Tears blurred her vision. She turned instinctively toward the man in 6C, seeking an anchor. He wasn't fumbling. He wasn't breaking. He was assessing. His gaze locked with hers again, calm but urgent, and then, without speaking, he raised his finger. He pointed directly at her seat. Claire blinked in confusion. Her seat? Why? Other passengers were shifting frantically, unbuckling, leaning into aisles, trying to switch spots with loved ones. She didn't move. She couldn't. His gesture was too precise, too commanding. His finger jabbed once more toward her, harder this time, and his lips shaped silent words. Stay there. The plane jolted again, engines screaming as the nose dipped. Lower. Claire's heart thudded violently, but she obeyed. She pressed herself back into the seat, oxygen mask tight against her face, her hands clutching the belt across her lap. Somewhere inside her, despite the terror, trust flickered. She didn't know why. She didn't even know his name. But something in his eyes told her that he wasn't guessing. He knew something the rest of them didn't. And in that moment, as the plane trembled under the weight of failing machinery, Claire believed him. The cabin was no longer a place of quiet murmurs and calm conversation. It had transformed into a cage of panic. Overhead compartments rattled violently, some bursting open as carry-ons tumbled into the aisles. A laptop slid down the tilted floor, smashing against an armrest. Claire's book flew from her hands and vanished beneath someone's seat. A baby's high-pitched screams pierced the air, competing with the collective gasps and cries of passengers. The oxygen masks swung back and forth, bouncing against faces and shoulders as turbulence tossed the plane like a toy. Passengers clawed at them, yanking the straps, their hands trembling too much to fit the masks properly. Some cried out in frustration. Others choked on shallow breaths, unable to calm themselves long enough to inhale. Claire's mask fogged with her desperate breaths. The elastic dug into her hair, pulling strands painfully, but she hardly noticed. Her lungs burned as adrenaline surged, every nerve screaming at her to run, though there was nowhere to go. Stay calm, everyone. Stay seated and keep your masks on. One flight attendant shouted, gripping the top of the seat for balance as the plane lurched again. Her voice cracked against the roar of the engines. She tried to demonstrate the brace position, her arms stiff, but passengers were too frantic to notice. The captain's warning replayed in Claire's mind brace for impact. Her blood turned cold. Impact meant crashing. Impact meant death. She tried to breathe steadily through the mask, but her chest tightened, rising and falling too quickly. She turned toward the aisle instinctively, searching for some shred of control amid the madness. That's when her eyes caught him again. Mark sat steady, a rock in the storm. He wasn't fumbling with his mask. He wasn't thrashing in panic like the others. His gaze was sharp, scanning the plane with the precision of a soldier on patrol. His hands gripped the seat in front of him firmly, but not fearfully. And then his eyes found hers. Claire froze. The chaos around her dimmed, muffled by the intensity of that stare. He didn't yell. He didn't wave his arms wildly. He simply raised one hand and pointed, directly at her seat. She blinked, confused. Was he signaling her? Why? The gesture was unmistakable. His finger was steady, deliberate, as if giving a direct order. The way he looked at her carried weight, a kind of authority that demanded obedience, the kind a commander might give to a soldier under fire. Her pulse quickened. Around her, passengers scrambled, switching seats to hold children, standing against orders, tugging at bags overhead. One man shouted angrily at a flight attendant, demanding answers. Another passenger prayed aloud, clutching a rosary. The plane jolted again, tossing a soda can across the aisle, but Mark didn't flinch. His finger remained fixed on her. Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to shout back, to ask why. Why her seat? Why not move? Why not do something else? But his eyes gave her the answer before she could form the question. His expression was clear, resolute. Trust me. The plane bucked hard, as if caught by invisible hands, shaking it from both sides. Passengers screamed. A woman dropped her mask in the commotion, clutching her chest in terror. Claire's stomach twisted, bile rising in her throat. She closed her eyes, gripping the armrests until her knuckles burned. When she opened them, Mark was still there, still pointing. It wasn't desperation in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was certainty. Claire's body trembled, but she stayed seated. Her instincts told her to move, to run, to find safety elsewhere. Yet something deeper urged her to obey. The way he commanded the moment reminded her of the professors who guided her through complex experiments, firm, precise, absolutely confident in their knowledge. Only this was no classroom. This was life or death. The flight attendants shouted over the roar, trying to restore order. Heads down, stay braced, do not get up. But passengers ignored them. Panic had swallowed reason whole. Some shouted, "Accusations! What's happening? Why aren't we landing? We're all going to die." The words ricocheted through the cabin, spreading dread like wildfire. Claire pressed her forehead against her knees, her hair falling forward. Her breath echoed inside the mask, loud and uneven. She thought of her mother waiting at the Dallas terminal, probably sipping coffee, checking her watch, expecting a simple reunion. Tears blurred Claire's vision. Would she ever see her again? The plane dipped suddenly, as though the floor had dropped away. Claire's body lifted from her seat for a split second before the belt yanked her back. Screams erupted anew. Overhead bins banged open, spilling more bags into the aisles. A glass bottle shattered, its shards skittering across the floor. Her heart pounded so fast it hurt. She thought she might faint. She turned once more, needing that anchor, and there he was. Mark had shifted slightly forward, gripping the headrest in front of him as the plane shuddered violently. His jaw was set, his eyes unblinking. And still his finger pointed toward her. A silent command. Across the chaos. It was madness, she thought. Madness to believe him, to trust some stranger whose name she didn't even know. But then again, what choice did she have? Nothing else made sense. The attendants were losing control. Passengers were spiraling into hysteria, and the captain's voice had disappeared into ominous silence. Only Mark seemed to carry clarity, as though he had trained his entire life for this exact nightmare. Claire inhaled deeply, forcing air into her lungs, and pressed herself hard into the seat. She tightened her belt until it dug into her hips. Her hands shook as she clutched the armrests, but she held her position. Whatever happened, she would stay, because he told her to, because something in her heart told her he was right. The cabin was chaos incarnate, screams, sobs, shouted prayers, the relentless roar of a wounded machine plunging into darkness. But in the storm, one gesture anchored her. A finger pointed, unwavering, toward survival. And Claire, for reasons she could not yet understand, obeyed. The aircraft pitched sharply, nose dipping toward the unseen earth below. Claire's stomach lurched as though the floor had vanished. Her hands clawed at the armrests, fingernails digging deep into the fabric. She heard her own scream tear from her throat, but it was swallowed instantly by the chorus of terror around her. Passengers shouted over one another, voices layered in panic. "God help us! We're going down! My baby, please, someone help!" The flight attendants staggered along the aisle, bracing themselves against seats, shouting commands that were drowned by the roar of the engines. Heads down. Stay braced. Do not move from your seats. Their voices cracked under the weight of fear, but they kept trying. The descent was relentless. Every few seconds, the plane bucked violently, tossing passengers forward, then sideways. Overhead compartments flung open like mouths, spewing bags that slammed into shoulders and heads. Claire ducked instinctively as a duffel bag crashed into the aisle beside her, spilling clothing across the floor. Her breath came fast and shallow through the mask. She could taste the plastic, smell the faint chemical tang of oxygen flooding into her lungs. Sweat pooled at her temples, dripping into her eyes. She squeezed them shut, forcing herself to inhale deeply, just as the man in 6C had instructed earlier. Mark. A name burned into her mind, though she hadn't heard it yet. She didn't know who he was, but she knew what he was: steady, unyielding, something she could cling to when everything else fractured. When she dared to lift her head, she saw him again. He sat like a commander in the storm, muscles coiled with control. His gaze darted not in fear, but in calculation, checking the angle of the wings, the way the cabin tilted, the rhythm of the failing engine's roar. His jaw tightened as another shudder rattled the fuselage, but his hands remained firm, his movements deliberate. And then once more, his eyes locked onto hers. Claire felt the connection like a lifeline. His expression was urgent, but not panicked, his finger raising again in that same commanding gesture. He pointed firmly toward her seat, stabbing the air with certainty. Stay there. Her body quivered, caught between instinct and trust. Every nerve screamed to move, to run, to find some pocket of safety, but there was nowhere to go. The aisles were chaos, passengers pushing, shouting, reaching desperately for loved ones. A man stumbled past, trying to climb toward the back, only to be slammed into the wall when turbulence jolted again. Sit down, a flight attendant yelled, pushing him back toward his seat. But he resisted, eyes wild. Panic had swallowed him whole. Mark didn't shout. He didn't rise. He simply fixed Claire with a look that cut through the storm, one that spoke louder than any scream. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. Claire's throat tightened as tears threatened. She shook her head faintly, mouthing a trembling why. He didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. His finger stabbed toward her seatbelt buckle, then pressed down in demonstration. His meaning was clear. Stay. Strap in. Don't move. The plane jolted again, harder this time. A horrible grinding sound tore from the wing as the remaining engine strained against the descent. The entire cabin rattled with the metallic scream. Claire cried out, clutching the armrest so hard her knuckles ached. Beside her, the mother shielded. Her baby, pressing the tiny mask against the infant's face, whispering lullabies through sobs. Claire's chest clenched. She wanted to reach out, to help, but her hands were frozen. She could barely help herself. She looked back toward the front. Mark hadn't moved from his seat, but his presence radiated control. His lips shaped two words, trust me. Something inside her shifted. Her terror didn't vanish, but it bent, reshaped into something else. If she obeyed him, maybe, just maybe, she'd survive this. The flight attendants finally reached her row, shouting instructions. Heads down, race position now. Their eyes were wide, their movements frantic, but their words mirrored what Mark had already told her silently. Claire lowered her head. Slowly, pressing her forehead against her knees, arms braced tightly around her legs. Her oxygen mask tugged uncomfortably, but she kept it sealed. Around her, passengers fumbled, some too frantic to follow correctly. A man across the aisle sat stiffly upright, refusing to bend, his hands covering his face. Another woman clutched her purse against her chest, sobbing into it. A flight attendant rushed to adjust them, forcing their heads down, repositioning. Arms, the cabin tilted again. A collective scream rose as the lights flickered overhead, plunging the space into a strobe of shadows and sparks. Claire's eyes darted open in fear. She saw sparks trailing from the wing, bright against the night. Flames licked briefly along the metal before vanishing in the slipstream. Her breath hitched. Oh God! Her tears soaked into the mask as she pressed her face down harder, but one thought anchored her. Mark told me to stay here. The engines howled again, a guttural sound that vibrated through every bolt and panel. Somewhere, a panel snapped loose, slamming against the wall with a metallic bang. Claire flinched, her heart threatening to burst. Then she felt it a hand, not on her, but steadying the air near her. She dared a glance sideways. Mark had leaned forward slightly in his row, gripping the headrest in front of him for balance, his body angled toward hers. His gaze burned into Her unblinking. Even from rows away, she felt the weight of his presence pressing against her fear. She wasn't alone. The plane dipped again, faster this time. The captain's voice crackled faintly over the intercom. Words chopped by static. Brace hold, tight impact minutes. Minutes. Claire's blood turned cold. Her mind screened with images her mother at the terminal, her unfinished thesis sitting on her desk, the life she thought she still had years to live. She wanted to cry out, to beg, to pray, but her voice failed. Instead, she clenched her fists and obeyed. She pressed into the brace position, every muscle trembling, heart pounding like a war drum. Her tears dripped onto the seat back in front of her. And through it all, one gesture remained unwavering. The finger of a man who refused to panic. The command of a soldier who had seen death before and beaten it back. The unspoken order that told her, "You'll survive this. Because I say so." And in that moment, she believed him. The descent had become a living nightmare. The aircraft shuddered violently, rattling like a dying animal fighting against gravity's pull. Every bolt and rivet seemed to scream. Every vibration, a reminder that the machine was straining past its limits. The cabin was filled with the raw sound of human terror screams, prayers, sobs blended with the metallic groan of stressed steel. Claire pressed her forehead against her knees, braced as instructed, but every nerve in her body begged to look up. She felt trapped inside her own skin, trembling, listening to the chaos swirl around her. Her oxygen mask tugged against her face, with each ragged breath. And then it happened. A sound like thunder ripped through the night. The right engine tore free with a deafening explosion, a shriek of metal that reverberated through the fuselage. The entire aircraft lurched hard to one side, sending passengers screaming as they were slammed against windows and armrests. Overhead, ends ripped loose, showering belongings across the aisles like hail. Claire screamed with them. Her body jolted so violently, her seatbelt cut into her hips. The sudden force threw her forward, but the reinforced structure of her seat absorbed the worst of it. She gasped, heart hammering, as a flash of fire streaked past her window. Through the tiny oval glass, she saw the impossible. Fragments of the engine, glowing like meteors, trailing sparks into the darkness. Flames licked briefly along the wing before extinguishing in the slipstream. The cabin filled with the acrid scent of smoke and burning metal, sharp and suffocating even through her mask. Passengers wailed, voices raw with terror. A woman 2 rows ahead struck her head against the bulkhead as she was thrown sideways. A man across the aisle clutched his bleeding arm, eyes wide with disbelief. Luggage skittered across the tilted floor, smashing into ankles and shins. The baby's screams rose higher, piercing the chaos. Claire's vision blurred with tears. She tried to suck in air, but her chest felt locked. Her seat rattled beneath her, vibrating like it might tear free. For a split second, she was certain this was the end. And then she saw him. Mark, he had. Braced hard against the seat in front of him, muscles straining, his body absorbing the violent lurch with practiced precision. His face was set, jaw clenched, eyes sharp not in fear, but in focus. Amid the chaos, he was the only still point, as though the storm bent around him. Their eyes met through the blur of smoke and flickering lights. And in that instant, Claire understood. This her seat, her position hadn't a chance. When he pointed, when he commanded her silently to stay, he had known. He had calculated the structure of the plane, the reinforced frame around the wing, the pocket of safety others overlooked. While panic had driven passengers to scramble, to move aimlessly, he had anchored her exactly where she needed to be. Her tears spilled freely, mixing with sweat, soaking into the mask. She wasn't safe, not yet, Not completely, but she was alive. She was alive because of him. The plane bucked again, diving sharply before leveling in a sickening glide. The lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across terrified faces. A stewardess stumbled, falling to her knees in the aisle, but Mark's arm shot out, steadying her by the elbow before she could be flung further. His movements were instinctive, controlled, the reflexes of someone who had done this guided others through life and death before. "Stay down," he barked, his voice carrying above the roar, crisp and authoritative. His tone cut through the chaos like a blade. Passengers who had been thrashing stilled for a moment, caught off guard by the power in his command. "Brace, hold tight." Claire pressed herself tighter against the seat, obeying without hesitation. Her body trembled, but her resolve held firm. If he said brace, she braced. If he said stay, she stayed. Trust had taken root, stronger than fear. The smell of smoke thickened, searing her throat. Her lungs burned, her eyes watered, but she forced herself to keep breathing through the mask. Around her, others coughed violently, their sobs muffled by plastic. The plane dipped again, tilting at a dangerous angle. Loose belongings clattered and slid. Someone shouted, "We're flipping! We're flipping!" The panic rippled like wildfire. Mark's voice boomed again, steady, commanding. "Stay seated. Heads down, ride it out." Claire's fingers dug into the armrest, nails biting the fabric. Her entire body shook with adrenaline, yet Mark's words held her steady. She didn't lift her head. She didn't move. She surrendered herself to the faith that he knew what she didn't. Through the mask, her sobs came ragged, broken. But beneath them, a strange clarity bloomed. He wasn't pointing anymore. He didn't need to. She understood now. Every command, every look he had been protecting her before she even realized she needed it. Another violent shudder rocked the fuselage. A metallic screech wailed as the damaged wing strained against the forces pulling it apart. Sparks erupted outside again, flashing through the windows like lightning. Passengers cried out, gripping one another in terror. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, her lips moving silently. "Please, God, let us land. Please, let me live." And through the roar, through the chaos, she heard it again, his voice. "Hold tight. We've got this." The words weren't just instruction. They were a lifeline. They were belief, forced into existence by sheer will. And somehow, against the nightmare. Unraveling around her, Claire believed him. A plane pitched again, and this time, Claire felt the heat. Smoke had begun to creep into the cabin, thin at first, then thickening, curling like ghostly fingers along the aisle. The acrid scent stung her nose and eyes. She coughed violently. Through the oxygen mask, her throat raw. Each breath felt hot, heavy, tainted, yet she forced it in, inhaling the limited flow of filtered air. Passengers around her were panicking. A man across the aisle clawed at his mask, fumbling it uselessly, gasping for air as tears streamed down his cheeks. A woman pressed her hands to her eyes, shivering violently, rocking back and forth in terror. The baby in the seat ahead screamed. Relentlessly, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Claire pressed her forehead to her knees, trying to block out the chaos. Her vision blurred through smoke and tears. She could barely see the rows around her, but she knew one constant mark. He had shifted slightly, still seated in 6C, his movements precise, almost mechanical. Every action had purpose. His eyes swept the cabin, scanning for those in immediate danger, noting the flow of smoke and the angle of descent. Even in the chaos, his calm dominance anchored the environment around him. Claire's pulse raced uncontrollably. I can't," she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. Panic clawed at her mind like a predator. Then she heard him. "Breathe, stay low, keep your mask on." His voice, firm and authoritative, cut through the roar of engines and the cacophony of screams. It wasn't yelling. It was command, practiced, and precise. It demanded obedience, not through fear, but through certainty. Claire obeyed instinctively, lowering her head, pressing her mask tighter, forcing air through ragged lungs. Her hands gripped the armrests as the plane bucked violently, and she noticed others beginning to mimic him. Those within earshot straightened their masks, braced their bodies, and tried to follow instructions. The cabin was still chaos, but it was organized chaos now. One man, previously thrashing, froze and lowered his head. A stewardess, coughing through the smoke, adjusted a passenger's mask at Mark's direction. He had become the center of authority, the eye in the storm. Claire's thoughts struggled to keep pace. How could one man hold this much control? How could he remain calm when death was pressing so close, when the engine screamed like the end of the world? But every instinct she had told her to trust him. The plane dipped again, sharply, throwing Claire against the seatbelt. Sparks flared. Outside the windows, metal groaned under strain, a shrill, ear-piercing cry. Claire bit her lip to keep from screaming. She forced herself to exhale through the mask, the rhythm of breath slow and steady as Mark had demonstrated. Smoke thickened, curling into the aisles. She saw a passenger near the back collapse, choking violently, unable to manage the mask. Another passenger reached desperately toward the oxygen tank, fumbling with panic. Mark sprang into action. He rose slightly, using the seat for leverage, and shouted instructions over the noise. "Reach for the mask slowly. Pull it over your nose and mouth. Breathe steadily. You can do this." His voice had no edge of fear, only the precision of training. He moved down the aisle quickly, steadying passengers, adjusting their posture, guiding their hands. His presence was a lifeline. Claire's eyes watered, smoke stinging her vision, but she stayed low, braced as instructed. She noticed something remarkable. Passengers were responding. Slowly, hesitantly, but they were obeying. The storm of terror was not eliminated, but it was being contained, directed by his authority. Mark's movements were efficient. One by one, he checked oxygen masks, braced knees, and hand positions. His calm confidence radiated outward, shaping panic into action. Even in the most chaotic moments, he calculated each movement with precision. Claire's heart began to settle slightly. Not entirely, she was still terrified, but a thread of control now held her in place. She clung to it like a life raft. She had no idea how he knew what to do, but she understood instinctively that, if she followed him, she had a chance. The plane pitched again, violently. Sparks flashed along the wing. A loud groan echoed through the cabin, and Claire's stomach dropped as if gravity itself had doubled. Her mask slipped slightly from her nose, and she fumbled to adjust it with trembling fingers. Mark's hand shot out, guiding hers with unflinching steadiness. "Press it firmly. Now. Keep it tight." She obeyed without hesitation. Relief flooded her as air finally moved steadily into her lungs. Her heartbeat slowed just enough to feel the rhythm again. Smoke thickened further, and visibility dropped. The lights flickered, dimming intermittently. Claire's world became a swirl of gray haze and flickering shadows. Some passengers were no longer responding. Claire saw a man near the rear slump against his seat, unconscious from smoke inhalation. Another woman clutched a child to her chest, tears streaking her soot-covered face. The plane's descent accelerated. Mark's voice rang out again, cutting through the chaos like a bell. "Brace! Everyone brace! Feet flat, head down, hold your mask tight. Trust me." Even over the roar and the screams, his authority was undeniable. Claire's body moved automatically. She braced, pressed her head to her knees, tightened her belt. Her hands shook violently, but she remained exactly where he had pointed her, exactly as instructed. The plane bucked once more, throwing passengers. Sideways, Claire felt the weight of bodies pressing past her. She wanted to scream, but Mark's eyes locked on hers again. That single look, filled with unwavering certainty, anchored her. I can do this, she told herself. I must do this. Outside, sparks streaked past the window like fiery comets. Flames flickered briefly along the torn wing. The ground seemed impossibly far below, yet closer with every second. The engines screamed, metal shrieked, and the cabin smelled of fire and burning plastic. And through it all, Mark remained a calm center. He guided, corrected, and commanded. He moved like a man who had trained every muscle, every nerve, every instinct for this exact scenario. His focus never wavered, not for a second. Claire understood now what trust really meant. Not hope, not prayer, trust, obedience, faith in someone who knew better. And for the first time since takeoff, she allowed herself to believe they might survive this. She exhaled slowly, bracing for the next jolt, her eyes never leaving his. Mark's voice carried again, steady, resolute. Stay low. Hold tight. We're not done yet. And with that, Claire knew she would follow him to the end. The ground surged upward, a terrifying presence that had been unseen only moments ago. Claire pressed herself harder into her seat, forehead against her knees, bracing as she had been instructed. Her body trembled uncontrollably, heart hammering. Like a war drum, sparks flared outside the windows, streaking past in fiery arcs. The shriek of the failing engine was deafening, a wail that seemed to scrape her very soul. Around her, the cabin had become a maelstrom of chaos. Passengers screamed, prayed, and flailed, many too late to obey instructions. Luggage tumbled across the floor, striking bodies, smashing into seats. A child wailed uncontrollably, arms flailing as parents tried desperately to restrain him. Smoke had thickened further, filling every corner of the cabin with a choking haze. Claire's vision blurred through the oxygen mask, tears stinging her eyes. She bit down on her lip, pressing herself tighter against the seat. She couldn't stop trembling, couldn't stop feeling the raw panic clawing at her chest. And then she felt it, Mark's presence. He had shifted slightly forward in his seat, bracing against the headrest in front of him. His eyes locked on hers, radiating calm authority. Despite the smoke, the screams, the unrelenting roar of the plane, he was steady. A silent command passed between them. Brace, hold, survive. Claire obeyed instinctively, pressing her head to her knees, gripping the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. Every muscle screamed in protest, every fiber of her being screamed to run, to escape. But there was nowhere to run. She clung to his guidance like a lifeline. The plane bucked violently again, throwing passengers forward in waves. Screams and shouts merged with the mechanical wail of engines. A man near the back slammed into the overhead compartment, knocking it loose. Bags tumbled down, scattering like debris from a storm. Claire flinched as a tray table struck her arm. Pain shot through her, but she remained braced. Mark's finger shot toward her once more, steady, precise, unwavering. She followed the gesture instinctively, tightening the strap of her seatbelt, and pressing herself as low as possible. She understood now that this was no longer guidance. It was survival. The plane tilted sharply. Sparks danced along the edges of the torn wing outside. The fuselage groaned, metal screaming in protest. Claire felt the terrifying sensation of the aircraft losing control. the world outside falling away into blurred streaks of darkness and fire. The captain's voice crackled faintly over the intercom, distorted and strained. "Brace! Brace! Brace! Emergency landing imminent." The words barely penetrated the roar, yet they were enough to reinforce Claire's terror. She pressed down, harder, gritting her teeth, squeezing her eyes shut. Her fingers dug into the seat as though she could hold herself together with sheer will. The plane dropped suddenly. A rush of wind swept through the cabin, a vacuum of motion that stole her breath. She felt herself lift slightly, then slam down with bone-jarring force. Every scream around her was magnified. The oxygen masks swung violently, dangling from the ceiling like ghostly pendulums. Claire thought she might vomit, thought she might lose consciousness. She focused only on Mark, on the unwavering anchor he represented. His calm, commanding presence cut through the storm. He was the tether that kept her mind from unraveling entirely. The ground loomed ever closer, blurring through windows streaked with sparks and fire. The fuselage shuddered violently as the aircraft scraped along jagged terrain. Claire's teeth clenched, her body pressed as instructed, but the sensation of uncontrolled force was overwhelming. Every fiber of her being screamed terror. And then she felt it, the contact. The aircraft slammed into the earth with a bone-rattling crash. The noise was catastrophic, a combination of metal tearing, engine screaming, and human panic. The cabin lurched violently, tossing passengers against each other and the seats. Claire's body slammed forward, but her seatbelt held firm, absorbing much of the impact. Her vision flashed with sparks, smoke, and fire. Shouts and screams filled every corner. A woman across the aisle struck her forehead against the overhead compartment. A child cried inconsolably, and a man groaned in pain as he tried to shield himself. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the metallic tang of burning machinery. Claire felt her own body twist violently with the momentum. Pain lanced through her arms, legs, and ribs, yet she clung to her seat, to Mark's invisible guidance. His finger had been pointing her to safety, as she realized now that it had worked. She opened her eyes just enough to see him. Mark's hand gripped the seat in front of him with unyielding strength. His eyes scanned the cabin, calculating. The next sequence, anticipating the motion of the fuselage, correcting passengers where possible. He was still the center of calm, the commanding force guiding chaos into order. Claire exhaled through the mask, forcing herself to breathe steadily. Pain coursed through her body, but she clung to that one truth. She was alive. She had survived. Because he had commanded her, instructed her silently, and kept her braced at the correct position. The plane skidded and shuddered across uneven ground. Sparks erupted as metal scraped against rocks and dirt. Claire gritted her teeth, holding herself down, following every instinct Mark had silently given her. Around her, some passengers were thrown from their seats. Some were injured, but many remained anchored, their survival linked to the precise control he had imposed over them. Minutes, or was it seconds? Stretched into eternity. Every jolt, every shake, every roar seemed like it could be the last. Claire could barely think through the smoke in fear. She could barely move, barely even breathe normally. But one thing was undeniable. She was alive, and Mark's presence had made it possible. Finally, the aircraft slowed. The violent motions diminished slightly. Sparks faded, and the fuselage creaked as it came to a partial stop. The oxygen masks dangled uselessly, the cabin thick with smoke and the acrid scent of fire. Passengers gasped, coughing, some too terrified to move. Claire's heart still pounded, but she forced herself to exhale slowly. She opened her eyes fully and looked toward Mark. He leaned slightly, scanning the cabin once more, ensuring everyone within reach was stabilized. His expression was calm, commanding, almost serene in contrast to the chaos around him. He looked at her and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. She pressed herself back into the seat, trembling with exhaustion, relief, and disbelief. She had survived, and it was because of him. The cabin was silent, save for the soft hiss of smoke and the occasional groan of injured passengers. Claire opened her eyes slowly, blinking through the haze. Her body ached from the violent motions of the crash, but she was alive. Every limb ached, ribs bruised, cuts stinging from debris, but alive. Around her, passengers stirred, some still coughing through the lingering smoke, others in stunned disbelief, their eyes wide, searching for loved ones. Mark was still in his seat, scanning the cabin. His posture, though rigid and alert, carried the first signs of relief. His eyes met Claire's, calm and assured, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She understood immediately. The crisis was over, and she had survived because of him. Claire's hands shook violently as she unbuckled her seatbelt, fumbling, briefly before managing to free herself. The adrenaline that had sustained her for the crash now left her trembling, leaving raw exhaustion in its wake. Every motion was laborious, but she rose slowly, taking careful breaths as she assessed herself and those around her. Passengers began to move cautiously, some standing unsteadily, others assisting those injured or dazed. The cabin smelled strongly, of smoke and scorched metal, acrid and suffocating. Claire coughed, her throat raw, and tried to shake off the haze clouding her mind. Mark finally rose, his movements deliberate, calculated. He leaned over, checking on passengers, ensuring those who could walk were moving toward the exits. Claire watched him, feeling the weight of the moment. He hadn't just commanded during the crash. He had saved lives through anticipation, authority, and calm precision. "Follow me," he said quietly, his voice steady, directing passengers toward the emergency exits. Claire obeyed instinctively, her legs trembling beneath her, muscles sore and joints aching. She pressed herself close to the aisle, moving in rhythm with him as he guided others. The smoke thickened near the front of the plane, forcing them to crouch low. Claire's mask had slipped off during the jostling, and she pressed a sleeve to her face to filter the air, coughing violently as she forced each breath. Around her, passengers were helping one another, guided by Mark's example. Even in the haze, his authority shaped the behavior of those around him, turning panic into coordinated movement. The first emergency exit loomed ahead, half buried, under twisted metal from the damaged fuselage. Mark stepped forward, assessing the angle, the structural integrity, the safest path for everyone. He extended a hand to a frightened woman ahead of Claire, guiding her over jagged debris. Claire followed, keeping low, trusting every movement he instructed. The ground outside was uneven, littered with debris and smoldering remnants of the engine and wing. Sparks still flared intermittently, sending shards of heat and light into the dark night. Claire's legs trembled, each step uncertain, but she pressed forward, following the rhythm of Mark's guidance. Behind them, passengers began to emerge from the smoke-filled cabin. Some were coughing violently, others in shock. Yet guided by Mark's calm authority, they moved steadily toward safety. Claire finally reached the open ground outside the plane. The cool night air hit her face, a stark contrast to the smoke and heat inside. She stumbled, lungs burning, body trembling, but relief flooded her. She had made it out. She was alive. Mark followed shortly after, helping the last passengers step onto the uneven terrain. His presence was unshakable, commanding, yet there was a faint trace of weariness in his movements. He had guided them through the impossible, yet he had remained composed, precise, and authoritative throughout. Claire finally allowed herself to breathe fully, inhaling the cool air as she sank to the ground, exhausted but alive. Around her, survivors were regrouping, checking on one another, helping the injured. Emergency lights flashed in the distance, signaling the approaching rescue teams. She looked at Mark, still scanning the area, ensuring every passenger was accounted for. Only then did she notice the subtle bruises along his forearms, the sweat streaking his hair, the tightness in his shoulders. He had carried the weight of the crisis silently, shielding everyone from the full force of panic with nothing more than his presence, his commands, and his knowledge. Claire's hands shook as she rose to approach him. I don't even know what to say," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. You saved all of us." Mark finally turned to her, his expression calm but kind. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly. "You listened. You stayed braced. You followed instructions." Claire shook her head, tears streaming freely. "No, you kept me alive. You knew what to do. You saved me." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We did this. Together. Everyone did their part. You held your position. That's why you're alive." She stared at him, trying to comprehend the enormity of what had just occurred. Every decision, every command, every gesture of his had been precise, calculated, and executed with the single goal of survival. His silent guidance had anchored her, given her the strength to stay composed in a moment when panic could have killed them all. Around them, emergency crews began arriving, rushing to assess the survivors, pull the injured to safety, and control the remnants of the burning plane. Claire watched, still trembling, as passengers were helped onto stretchers, guided by paramedics, while firefighters moved toward the plane to extinguish lingering flames. She sank onto the ground beside Mark, exhausted but alive, her body trembling from adrenaline, shock, and relief. For the first time since boarding the plane, she allowed herself to fully exhale, to process the reality. She had survived a catastrophic crash. She was alive. Mark sat beside her, quietly observing the scene, ensuring everyone was accounted for, his calm presence never wavering. Claire felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude, not just for his actions, but for his unwavering composure, his authority in the chaos, his precise instructions that had guided her through the impossible. She looked up at him, tears still streaming. "I don't think anyone will ever understand what you did," she whispered. "Not just me. Everyone. You saved us all." He shook his head slightly, a faint, almost wry smile touching his lips. "I just did what needed to be done," he said simply. "I was trained for moments like this. You did your part too." Claire nodded, understanding now that survival wasn't just about one person. It was about trust, discipline, and acting in unison with someone who knew better. She thought of every gesture, every pointed finger, every command he had given during the descent and crash. Without that silent guidance, she knew she wouldn't be sitting here alive. Emergency crews finally arrived to secure the crash site fully. Survivors were guided to safety, blankets were handed out, and triage began. Claire remained seated on the ground for a long moment, catching her breath, processing what had happened, and letting the realization settle in. Life, fragile and fleeting, could hinge on a single decision, a single act of authority, at a single, critical moment. Mark helped her to her feet as the crews began their work. She leaned on him slightly, grateful for his steadying presence. Around them, survivors were being assessed, moved, and comforted. The chaos of the crash had passed, replaced by the solemnity of relief, exhaustion, and awe. Claire finally looked at him fully, understanding. She had survived the impossible because of Mark the SEAL Aviator, whose presence, precision, and authority had turned terror into survival. Every pointed gesture, every silent command, every steadying touch had been a thread of life, guiding her and countless others through the nightmare. She swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. "I'll never forget this," she whispered. "Ever." Mark gave a small, steady nod. "Neither will I," he replied quietly. "But you survived. That's what matters." For the first time since boarding, Claire felt a profound sense of gratitude, awe, and relief. She had lived through something unimaginable, and she understood fully the power of calm authority in the face of chaos. She would remember this moment, the man who had silently guided her to safety, for the rest of her life. And as the night settled around the crash site, with emergency lights flickering and crews moving steadily among the survivors, Claire realized one immutable truth: survival is never accidental. It is earned through discipline, trust, and the presence of someone extraordinary in the right place at the right time. Mark had been that someone, and she was alive because of him.